Hello and welcome back to Aetheral Space 15.3, Only we are back.
Yes, and as a reminder to our viewers, if you're enjoying Aetheral Space, please leave a review on Royal Road, or give us a review on Spotify. Either would be hugely helpful for the series' growth, and thanks for listening. So this is the Sed, huh? Ruth said, looking down at the dark world. Home sweet home, Bruno muttered. There wasn't much to see, Ruth noted. With the sun down, there was no light in the complex at all, concealing nearly everything from view. With the searchlight their ship was equipped with, they could only barely make out the shapes of dilapidated, block-shaped buildings, like a child had tipped their box of toys over. This isn't actually the Sed, Serena cut in. That's further up the hill, right, Bruno? This is just the city. Overhearing their conversation, Morgan stepped up into the cockpit, peering into the monitor to look at the settlement below. What, people used to live here? He asked. It's a training ground, Bruno said bitterly. Or a testing ground. Like how they test bombs. Nobody lives here but mannequins. Well, that's creepy. Bruno just shot him a look and grunted. Ruth tightened her grip on the controls as she took them forward, sweeping over the faux city and taking them towards the Sed proper. The trip here hadn't been the most comfortable. Morgan and the Seds had worked together briefly before, apparently, but the last time Ruth had properly interacted with Noct had been back on Elysian Fields. Things had gotten complicated back there, and they'd ended up fighting side by side, but still. Even then there was the stowaway. Ruth glanced over her shoulder, back towards the starboard section of the ship, where Anatrice Del Sed was sitting, knees to her chest as she stared off into space. Pierrot hadn't said a word about her coming along, and yet the kid had insisted anyway. Ruth knew she could take care of herself, but still. From what she knew of the Sed, she didn't think it would be a place Anatrice would be keen to return to. Watch where we're going, Morgan muttered. Ruth turned back to the monitors. I am. You were literally looking the opposite way just now. I can pilot if you want, Bruno offered. It's fine, Ruth replied tersely. She knew full well that Bruno was a better pilot than her, but he'd already been flying for hours. He deserved a rest. Besides, she was damned if she was going to give up the pilot seat because some special officer thought she wasn't up to the challenge. I've got to say, Morgan said, leaning into the window, I'm not seeing any signs of activity down here. If there were people using this place, wouldn't they at least have some lights set up? They could have just been passing through, Bruno said. Or they could be hiding from sight. There's an underground level to the testing ground, too. Or they could be at the Sed itself. That it? Ruth asked as they crested the hill. From the description she'd heard, there was no doubt about it. A blood-red dome, starkly contrasting the white fool's snow all around it. The lights were off there, too, though, and a long, jagged crack had developed in the dome itself over time. Just looking at it screamed abandoned. Maybe that was the point, though? Bruno took a deep breath. I guess we're not figuring anything out from up here. You want to go down? Ruth asked, glancing over her shoulder. I don't see we've got a choice, Bruno grunted. Open the hatch. I'll get the bikes ready so we can move out. We sweep the facility, then get back here. I don't want to stick around. You'll hear no complaints from me, Morgan said, wrist resting against his sheathed sword. Blaine, you'll stay here. We'll need to be ready to leave in case things take a turn for the worse. Ruth narrowed her eyes. Again, the guy was right. But did he really have to order her around like that? The hatch, Ruth, Bruno reminded her. Oh, right, Ruth muttered, flicking the switch to open the hatch on the ship's underbelly. That way, the bikes could drop onto the snow field below. Thunk! The weapon twitched. It had been sitting at the head of a table in the test settlement, surrounded by mannequins frozen in the poses of a bustling party. The table was laid with prop food, never-living meats and stone-cold vegetables half spilling onto the floor from their dusty plates. The weapon might have sat there forever, indistinguishable from the mannequins. But it had heard it. Thunk! If the mannequins had eyes, they would not have seen the weapon leave. 1 second it was there, and the next it was gone. It left only the slightest residual blue light, washing over the mannequins' painted faces before fading into nothing. 10. Ruth Blaine took a breath. 9. She blinked. 8. Her fingers moved over the controls. 7. 6. 5. The shelf holding the fold-away motorcycles began to emerge from the wall. 4. Bruno stepped out of its way. 3. The shelf stopped moving. 2. The motorcycles began to unfold. 1. Morgan opened his mouth to say something. Bang! But before he could, the nightmare began. Without warning, the ship shook like it had crashed into a mountain. The lights deactivated all at once, plunging them into absolute darkness, save for the dim glow of the controls, which, a moment later, were devoured by a swarm of crackling arcs of electricity. An alarm blared just for a second before that cut off too. Bang! The second strike was even louder than the first, and this time it was accompanied by the creak of failing integrity. One of the cycles flew from the shelf and smashed against the wall, illuminating the room for the briefest of moments with the sparks it produced. Ruth leapt out of her sight, mind racing, still trying to figure out exactly what was happening. Bang! 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 Each attack, assuming this was an attack, sent everything in the ship flying in every direction. Ruth manifested her skeletal claws and dug them into the wall beside her, just to keep herself in place. Gritting her teeth, she looked out into the abyss below her. It was funny. Pretty often recently, she'd wondered what Skipper would do in her place. Too often, she didn't know the answer. Better, at least, she knew that. He'd been a man who could find the ideal way out of any problem. A hero. That wasn't something she could always match up to. Now, though, she knew exactly what she'd do. "Abandon ship!" she roared. Red aether coalescing at her feet, she launched herself off the wall, using an aether ping to light up the room for a split second. One kick off a falling bike fired her towards Bruno, grabbed, and another kick off the floor sent her shooting towards Anatrice, grabbed, her wriggling cargo under her arm. She whirled around to look at Morgan. "We need to go!" she said. Bang! 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 It was a wonder they hadn't actually crashed yet. Morgan raised his sword high, shrouded it with smoke, and unleashed a flurry of slashes at the floor below him. The blade danced purple, and a hole opened up in the floor. They didn't waste any time, both of them leaping out into the pitch-black night. It was a good thing, too, as they didn't have any time to waste. Bang! The instant they were out of the ship, it was struck again, and this time the blow was mighty enough to nearly tear the vessel in half. Ruth snapped her head up to look as the remains of the ship spun out of control. Bang! And this time she was able to see what exactly was dooming it. Lightning. Lightning was striking the ship again and again, each time leaving a vicious scorch mark like a massive cigarette burn. One final bolt slammed down into the fuselage as it was exposed, and the ship exploded into an aurora of flames and shrapnel. If not for Bruno's force fields and Ruth's armor, she had no doubt they'd have been shredded by the tiny shards of metal. Well, they had bigger concerns anyway. Number one was the ground. Ruth braced for impact, concentrating nearly all her aether into her legs, but she needn't have bothered. Before she could hit the ground, a rope of smoke wrapped around her waist, and Morgan Noct pulled her and the rest of the group close. He'd created what looked like a hand glider from the strange fog. It was haphazard and misshapen, but it served to slow down the descent enough for a safe landing. Her feet touched down on the... Well, doesn't she have, like, weird industrial legs?
Yeah, but they still break and they're still physical objects.
Okay. I didn't know if she had, like, feet or if they were, like, weird platforms of metal.
Well, they are, but... they're still feet.
I got you. Analogous to feet. Her feet touched down on the moss-covered roof of an old building, and she put down her passengers. "Stay alert," Morgan said seriously, sword held out in front of him, eyes flicking around for their attacker. "Whatever did this is still here." "You don't have to tell me twice," Bruno replied. He'd already erected a force field around their group, and his own eyes were angled up towards the sky, watching for another bolt of lightning. He'd seen it too, then. Ruth ground her skeletal claws together, producing a rain of bright sparks as she stood protectively in front of Anatrice. "Let's do this," she told herself, willing her blood to pump faster, her adrenaline to flow faster. "Come on, yeah, let's do this!" "You said there was an underground section," Morgan asked, back-to-back with Bruno. No, Serena. "Mm-hmm," she said seriously. "If the enemy's using lightning, we need a roof over our heads," Morgan continued. "Do you remember the way?" Serena considered it for a second before quickly nodding. "Okay," Ruth breathed. "We all move at once. Go!" Morgan took a step forward to lead them off the rooftop, but before his foot could hit the ground, there was a flash of blue next to him. For the briefest of instants, Ruth saw a humanoid blur appear in their midst, an after-image of an after-image. Morgan saw it too, and with reflex born from crisis, he swung his sword with all his strength. It wasn't that he missed. The sword did not hit the enemy, but it wasn't because Morgan had missed. His sword was missing. He looked down. His arms were missing, too. The moment was preserved in horror and left to dry. As Morgan opened his mouth to scream, blood spraying from the torn stumps of his arms, Ruth caught sight of the enemy once again. It was standing far behind Morgan, holding his severed arms in its hands, and as Ruth caught sight of it, it dropped the limbs onto the floor. Then, it raised a finger and blasted a bolt of lightning right through Morgan's heart. His corpse crumpled to the floor, blood still fishing from its wounds. Serena's face stretched into Bruno's expression of shock and agitation. As he took control of the body, he thrust his hands forward to create the strongest shield he could. No. It was too late for that. The enemy had already moved again, and now it pressed an index finger against Bruno's temple. It was just a spark, but it was enough. There was a small flash of blue light, and Bruno and Serena dropped dead to the floor, some vital lodestone burnt out of their brain. Unlike Morgan, their face was not contorted in pain. They had simply been deactivated between one thought and the next. Ruth opened her mouth as she looked down at the bodies, but all that emerged was a strange, crackling groan. This couldn't be happening. She could feel her heartbeat thumping all the way down to her fingers, but it felt like someone else's. Finally, words found her. "I'll kill you!" she screamed, her voice reflexively infused to such a degree that blood sprayed from her throat. The direwolf set wrapped itself around her, and she launched herself at the enemy with all her might, red sparks dancing around her jagged claws. The monster, for its part, just stood there, flickering in place, blurred by absurdly fast idleness. Until it didn't. 3 lightning bolts struck out, and Ruth managed to dodge them by mere inches, but then, right before Ruth's claws would have met flesh, the monster vanished. Anatrice Delsed gasped. Ruth knew what it meant before she even turned around. She'd seen it twice now, in the last few seconds. She'd seen it many times now, over the last few weeks. She'd seen it countless times, over the course of her life. Still, she turned around. Anatrice's severed head rolled across the floor and stopped at her feet. Ruth met its empty eyes with empty eyes of her own. Oh, she thought. Skipper wouldn't have let that happen. Ruth Blaine felt the claw of despair once more. Bang! And then she felt the bite of lightning. Only I. Oh my god. This is crazy work. There's no way they're all dead, right? This is a plot of yours, a scheme. Is this a flashback to earlier?
Keep reading.
If the enemy's using lightning, we need a roof over our heads, Morgan continued. Do you remember the way? Serena considered it for a second before quickly nodding. Okay, Ruth breathed. We all move at once. Go! Morgan went to move, but before he could take so much as a single step, the earth shook beneath them. Ruth swore under her breath as she steadied herself against the trembling building. First lightning, now earthquakes. What the hell was going on here? She only had time for that one thought. Before she could have another, her vision was overtaken by sheer white. Winds buffeted against her body from below, nearly strong enough to send her flying. She raised her arms to shield her eyes from the sudden onslaught, and she had no doubt her allies did the same. The temperature dropped drastically and instantaneously, until Ruth's teeth were chattering uncontrollably, her skin feeling like it was about to freeze and crumble against her flesh. She could barely hear Morgan as he spoke. B! He forced out. L! With the flames Morgan produced, the cold abated somewhat, and Ruth was finally able to open her eyes. They and the building itself were surrounded on all sides by sheer walls of ice, and a roof, too, encasing them entirely in a structure like a hollow iceberg. What was this? Was this an attack? Ruth turned on the spot, claws drawn, ready for anything, and suddenly stopped. Someone else was here. Crouching on the other side of the roof was a young woman with scarlet eyes and raven black hair. A crimson cloak hung off her form, pooling on the floor like a blood stain. The tense expression on her face made it difficult to tell if she was friend or foe. But as Ruth and the others watched, she reached into her cloak and pulled out a script, holding it up towards them. A familiar voice came from the device. What did they make her sound like again?
Well, she's an old lady.
Hello, children, said the widow. If you want to live, I'd recommend going with young Miss Knox here. Or, in simpler terms, run. Ruth opened her mouth to argue. Bang! But as white-hot lightning struck the ice roof above, nearly blasting right through it in one blow, she thought better of it. Run! She roared, and the others moved to follow. Is this related to the General Knox we know and love?
They're the same family, yeah.
Oh, a descendant. Interesting. So, wait, what happened with the last thing? Was this, like, alternate reality?
Perhaps we will find out.
Fractalized reality? The eyes of a lion watched their regress. Not the heart of a lion?
No.
Do we know this name?
Yes.
Who is this?
See if you remember.
Blackmane purred contentedly to himself as he watched the latest subject scurry away from the service, led by young Alcera Knox into the underground tunnels. Is he, Alternative Weapons Lab?
Absurd Weapons Lab Director.
Absurd Weapons Lab. Yeah, that was good to see. Oh yeah, the new lion guy. That was good to see. There was little point in leaving the door open for new participants in the experiment, if the weapon was just going to kill them instantly. The presence of only I had proven to be the boon he had hoped for. Still, Blackmane had concerns. The Dark Lion walked over to the front of the control room, paws thumping against the metal floor as his thin tail swished in the air behind him. The monitors in front of him displayed feeds from all across the testing ground, and the consoles before him were manned by his capable subordinates. He offered young Yozel... Is it Yozel?
Yeah.
He offered young Yozel a curt nod as he passed. The girl just shrunk away. Oh, did she dislike cats? 2 graduates of the SED, he purred, deep voice filling the room. Arriving by coincidence. That's not possible. Is this your doing, Erica? He turned his head to the 2 Del Seds. Erica didn't deign to speak to him directly, but Tybalt stepped forward as usual. The young man had his black hair tied back into a severe bun, and a certain cold emptiness in his green eyes. That, at least, told Blackmane who precisely he was speaking to. We are not involved, Tybalt said calmly. There would be no benefit in that for us. As he spoke, his id hung off his neck by its arms, taking the shadowy form of some monkey-like creature. Behind him, his superego giggled, the pitch-black jester towering above the young man. Blackmane narrowed his eyes. See no evil. Even with his greatest level of visual acuity, he couldn't see any fluctuations in the aether that would suggest his collaborators were lying to him. Was this truly a coincidence, then? No, he couldn't believe that. Very well, he grunted, turning back to the monitors. Leave us. I'll reach out when I need you. Erica, her arms crossed, walked calmly out of the room. Tybalt took 2 steps before his superego dove into his body, ejecting his ego as the silent shadow of a man in a hat. His hair bun popped out into a long and loose braid, and he skipped playfully after his superior, chuckling all the while. Back when the set had operated, it had hosted 3 branches of experimental subjects beneath its dome. Splitters, maskers, and controllers. It didn't take a genius to work out which one Tybalt Del Sed was. On the monitor, the weapon waited. I assume a splitter?
Yeah.
Oh, and we have an art. I can't see. Wait, who is this? Is this the weapon?
Yeah.
It's hard to tell because the image is small, but it looks like a suit of armor with a little white head.
He's got a little mask, yeah.
Oh, it's a mask. Oh, I gotta make this image bigger.
I'll make it bigger for you. That better?
So the mask is like a cross?
It's got a symbol on it.
What's the symbol? I can't really tell. Is it T?
You wouldn't recognize it. You wouldn't get it.
Sure, but is it like a scythe? Is it the symbol of the SED?
I'll say it needs more context than I can just sort of say right here.
It's cool, whatever it is. Good job, Tinks. It had paused in the air high above the building. It did not float, it just stood on thin air, as if the electricity buzzing beneath its feet was generating a temporary surface. Its white and black mask stared off into space, and its black combat suit nearly blended in with the night sky behind it. White hair billowed in the wind, the only sign of motion in that lethal existence. Now that its targets had left the designated area, it was no longer permitted to pursue them. The weapon remained in position for a few moments before vanishing in another shower of sparks. It was waiting for its next target to appear, for it to hear another noise and to begin another 10 seconds. Such was its purpose. Blackmane did pity it, but it had been the work of his predecessor. There was nothing to be done now but make use of the suffering. That was the only way anyone could accomplish anything in this excruciating world. Still, he felt sorry for the subjects, too. Those who had haplessly arrived here and put their necks in the guillotine. But the time for such fripperies had long since passed. Forgive me, little ones, he sighed as he turned away from the screens and trotted off into the depths of the Thinker's Comet. But this is all for the survival of humanity. Oh my god, Spiral King? Spiral King Blackmane? Wow, what an interesting chapter. I'm curious to see what comes next. Let's see what we have in terms of aetheral questions, shall we?
Sure.
Let me... okay. So PC asks, did the whole thing Acclima was so worried about ever actually happen before? The heir being killed / supplanted by their bodyguard?
Not precisely, but I think it's a pretty reasonable thing to be concerned about.
Fair. MT asks, what happened to King Smile and the assassin couple that weren't named during the Oliphant arc? Were they at the banquet?
King Smile got murderized by Mr. Fix.
No! What about the assassin couple?
They retired.
Oh, nice. Rockshark asks, if Anatrees used ego emulation on a Tree of Might member, and that Tree of Might member proceeded to use Absolution to seal away all other Aether abilities for a power boost, what would happen?
So it would work, I would say, because once she's emulating their ego, her ability, which is ego emulation, is counted as separate from the Aether. So they're sealing off their other Aether abilities when they use Absolution. It wouldn't seal off.
Oh, so it wouldn't be like a Toji situation where they just take over the body?
No.
Could someone Toji Anatrees in theory?
They could try. They could do like a Sukuna thing where somehow take it hostage, I guess. So like, if you deactivate ego emulation, you die.
I guess my body is stronger than your mind, or your soul, or whatever.
They couldn't work that way, but they could like do something to like leverage.
Weiser asks, is it public knowledge, or at least known inside the upper ranks of the Final Church, that Dragon killed the mad Apex Bishop Giovanni?
It is not known, no.
Secondly,
it's known by like the chorister and some people, but they don't. Yeah, no, it's not really known.
Secondly, does anyone know that Dragon killed Commissioner Caesar?
No one was there for that. Well, no one who was there for that survived that.
Damn.
Apart from Dragon.
JT asks, what are some Aether marriage traditions? I assume he means like an Aetheral Space, not specifically Aether, unless you have some for both.
You got plenty in the Final Church, because they've got lots of shit going on in there. You probably get a lot of Final Church-esque ones as well. So a lot of it is down to like planets, individual planetary traditions and things like that. They get filtered through the Y sort of faith usually.
Okay, so marriage is still tied to religion in this universe. And
Generally.
it still exists as an institution. Very interesting. Okay. JT asks, also, how similar was Marie expanding her brain to see the future to what they do on Aber Facade?
It's the exact same thing.
Nice.
What they
Rurum
do
asks,
on Aber Facade is they use, because they can't turn their entire body into a big brain, they compensate for that with Aether by just making their brain so efficient at it.
nice. So one is optimizing and the other's expanding capacity.
Exactly. Gene Tyrants and Aether Precognition is the exact same thing. Precognition is exactly the same thing. It's just guessing what's going to happen, but it's a very, very, very educated guess.
Okay. Rurum says, Achilles Esmeralda. 1. What was he up to during Henry's reign if he was around?
He was an executioner.
2. What did his other children get up to, if anything?
A lot of them faded out of history, generally. They did not make it big, generally. Some of them were in the Supreme Guard, and then they also faded out of history once that was disbanded.
Well, I know you vaguely alluded that there was like a whole generation with like Gregory and Negan and all them and Skipper.
Well, they're not the same generation, no.
Damn.
Skipper's way older than them.
Alright, well, I'm going to leave it off there for now. Thank you all for watching, but we will see you next time. Bye!
Bye!